Always good. Okay. So we already talked a lot about the form of the Raven, and we also talked about like the structure of a sonnet last time. And so what I'm just going to do, as I'm not really going to talk about the format for the Raven, I'm just going to look at the meaning and kind of what's the story about and what's going on. And we'll do a little stuff, a few things about Poe himself. So
Ooh.
maybe that'll be interesting for people. And then if we have time, then we might go to another sonnet and look at it. But for the most part, we're going to concentrate on the Raven today. And I may do, I'll try to do a couple of sonnets in my Thursday morning class, and I'll record that and put that into this classroom as well. Just like I share this classroom's discussions with that class too. So hopefully between the two classes recordings, everybody gets what everybody needs. So if you're watching the recordings, just, bear with me. There may be some questions you have after you watch a recording. You can always email me about it. And if there's something I need to clarify, I can do that through email as well. So, but let's talk about, this is actually probably Edgar Allan Poe's most famous work. We do have, I think there's a movie coming out soon that's The Fall of the House of Usher, and that's actually based on his short story. We've had several films, The Pit and the Pendulum. There were a huge number done in like I don't know, the 60s with Vincent Price in them. And you guys probably
Ooh.
don't have a clue who Vincent Price is, but he is
I
the
know who he
voice.
is.
You do? Yay.
Yeah.
He's most famous for younger people from the song Thriller by Michael Jackson,
Yeah.
because he's the voice that's saying the poetic verse in the background and then laughing at
Yeah.
the end. And that is his real laugh. And he was not an ugly person or anything, but he could certainly be creepy. And he specialized for a while acting in movies that were based, at least, loosely, on some of Edgar Allan Poe's work. And some of the movies actually are entitled by one of the stories or something, but they often incorporate several different scenarios from other stories as well, which is very weird. But if you've read a lot of the stories, then they actually pop up. However, his poetry, of all of the poems he's written, I mean, there are some folk singers back in the 50s or whatever kind of got into musical versions of some of his songs. I'm trying to think of, I know Annabelle Lee was one of them that ended up being put to a song. But The Raven is one of those that just survives, probably because its imagery is so weird, and it still has that creepy sort of Halloween kind of theme going, which a lot of Poe's stuff has. So it essentially what this is, and we're moving into Gothic literature. And Gothic literature is not like Gothic cathedrals. Those were built during the Gothic era back in the late medieval period, but the word Gothic was even used to describe it, as because it was deemed to be monstrous or grotesque or ugly. And that idea and that term and the kind of fascination with that term continues now. And so we still have, that's where we get the people who are called, who are goths today, or emo. And they wear all black, and they dye their hair black, and they paint their fingernails black, and they wear black lipstick. And I'm a closet goth, I think. I don't like the black lipstick, and I have shockingly blonde hair, but I wear a lot of black. And I've had people in college, they even asked me, so do you just go to a funeral every day? And they just didn't understand I was in theater. And so we had to wear black for almost everything. And so I just didn't have that much money. So I just wore black. I still wear a lot of black, but it's not because I'm a creepy person or anything. But I do like, and most people who read a lot of, who read some of this, not only short stories but also poetry, they like these stories. They're fascinating. They like the kind of macabre stuff. They like the ghosts and the creepy things going on. So this is full of ghosts and creepy things. But we need to establish one thing first. And I want to be really cautious about this. Essentially, do you remember what we called the main character of a story?
The protagonist?
The protagonist. And if somebody worked against him, or if it was man versus nature or something, that it could be the antagonist. In a poem, though, it is that either the person speaking, so like this is many poems are in first person, which is, and it's the far more in poetry are first person than in prose. So it's you definitely are going to tend to have a lot of I pronouns being used. So this is in first person, but the person speaking is called not the protagonist, but the persona. Okay. And the persona could be the author, but you can never assume the persona is the author. So be really careful. Now, there are some exceptions. In sonnets, because so many of the sonnets are kind of like confessional, they're confessing their love to somebody else or something like that. A lot of those are deemed to be where the protagonist, I mean, the persona and the author are the same. We know, I talked about in the earlier chat today, I talked about Sonnets from the Portuguese by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And her poetry tends to be very confessional, and she speaks of herself. Even Emily Dickinson, we think, for the most part, speaks of herself. Like she is the persona. She's always speaking from this I point of view because she's really trying to express her own point of view. But we cannot assume that. So a lot of people read the prose and the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe, and they assume he's scared to death of being buried alive. He is constantly haunted by the women he's lost. He's a drinker. He's all sorts of other things, and we just assume that all of these things that he expresses through his characters that are true about himself. We cannot assume this. In fact, we know Edgar Allan Poe didn't drink. He was actually part of a temperance society, and he was not a drinker. We know that at his death, though, he was found delirious, and a lot of people thought he was drunk. And then he had a fever, and he seemed really sick, and then he died. But we have some people are like, oh, see, he fell off the wagon. We have no indication, honestly, that he ever drank. And yet he has many characters who even tell their own stories who drink. The Cask of Amontillado is all about this man who's essentially leading another man down into the catacombs of Paris so that they can drink out of a cask of wine. And, and they're drinking, so, but that's not Edgar Allan Poe. And so what I really want to make sure people do, and this is something hopefully people watch on the video, is don't assume. It could be, this person could be, this persona could be the author, but you cannot assume that it is. So instead of saying the author, always say the persona. So in this case too, and it's very common, Edgar Allan Poe is writing about this man who's a young man who lost a love. We know that biographically, we know that Poe did lose his wife, and she was very young when he married her, but she also died very young, and he was devastated by the loss of her. We know too that he often talked about in many different poems and even some prose about this lost Lenore. Now, her name was not Lenore in real life, but we think this is a pseudonym for her. But we don't know for sure. And we can't say for sure that this young man, because he's in here pining over the lost Lenore, that this is all about Poe. And I guess I just want to make that clear. I know I took way too long to explain all that. But I just want you to treat it as if this is a character talking and not necessarily the author, even if there are parallels that go with this. So if we talk about Poe, or we talk about this particular person, he's describing a setting, and we're just going to try to figure out what's happening in this story, because this is a narrative poem. He's telling a story. It's first person, but it's not just it's not a scene that's just showing some aspect of nature. It's not a contemplation of just some idea. This is an actual story with events that happen and a plot and stuff like that. So what we're going to do is kind of go through and figure out what happened in this story. And it is a bit magical and mystical, but it's still set in a realistic sort of setting. So it is already kind of setting the mood though at the beginning, because when is this happening? What time of day?
Midnight.
Yes. And it's a dreary midnight. It's not just a regular midnight. And he's actually kind of like been thinking, but he even sort of fell asleep. So he was pondering over a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, which means he was reading probably folk tales or something. But he was reading and he sort of fell asleep. I nodded, nearly napping. So he's like drifting off to sleep at midnight. And suddenly, what happens?
He hears a tapping at the door.
Somebody is knocking at the door. And he says, it's just some visitor tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. And now he goes back and he slows it down. So he doesn't just get up and go to the door and open it. Instead, he says, wait. And you can tell he's reminiscing. He's thinking back. So then we go back to the beginning. You could say, once upon a midnight. This is like almost like a fairy tale. Once upon a time, this happened to me. Oh, wait, I remember it was in the bleak December. And each separate dying ember wrought its ghost. So in other words, he has a dying fire in the fireplace at midnight in December. So it's, it's cold and dark and bleak. And so he's just establishing more of that mood. And he says, eagerly, I wished the morrow. In other words, he's waiting for tomorrow. And he's hoping to read from his books and not be sad. A surcease, he sought to borrow from my books a surcease of sorrow. So he wants to end his sadness by distracting himself with his books. It's like, like we do with phones. We just distract ourselves from stress, from anxiety, from sadness, from loneliness, whatever. And we get on TikTok or something. And then he says what the sorrow's about. And he names her, and it says, and he calls her radiant and rare. And he says the angels named her Lenore. Now this is actually kind of if we go back to Annabel Lee, which is another poem, he actually says the angels were jealous of his love for Annabel Lee. And so they chilled her with the, a wind from the sea. But in this case, he's saying that the angels named her this. She's just, of course, that connects her to heaven. And he says, nameless here forevermore. So he's not going to name her again. He's not going to speak her name, because that conjures up that sorrow, even though he just said her name, which is kind of weird. And then he's just still lying there. He doesn't get up. So somebody knocks on the door and he doesn't yell out. He doesn't get up and answer. He just still lays around. And so the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. Of course, now he's thinking of all of these fears. And so, and the fact that he had the knocking added to it, and it's midnight, and there's a dying fire, and he's already sorrowing over Lenore, and he almost fell asleep. It's all very disconcerting. And so out loud, to make himself feel less like freaked out, he says, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door." Some late visitor. So he's like, somebody's at the door, he's just visiting late. This it is and nothing more. It's not something creepy. It's not anything to be afraid of. It's just, oh, that's just a normal person knocking. I don't know if you've ever gotten someone knocking at your door late at night, but it is very disconcerting. Somebody actually knocked. It would end up being one of my daughter's friends to come over and pick up something she'd forgotten. But literally, she knocked, and it was 8:30. It wasn't even that late. And my husband and I looked at each other, and he says, "Were you expecting anybody?" And we got all freaked out. The truth is at midnight, who's knocking at your door at midnight?
Woo-hoo.
The cops, a bad person, Freddy Krueger, something, Jason. But
Woo-hoo.
we don't ascribe, regular people don't visit at midnight. I don't know if you agree with, I've never had anybody, if you get a call that late, it's something bad, right?
Oh yeah.
It's always going to be something bad. Like nobody wants to get a call on their phone at midnight. I don't anyway.
Me
So
neither.
But he says, no, it's just some visitor coming late. Some late visitor. Like this, okay, yes, it's midnight, but they're just late. And so he says, okay, I'm going to get up. And he says, he addresses the door and says, sir, said I, or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But I was napping and you tapped so gently and I didn't hear you at first. And it says that scarce was sure I heard you. Even though it's a lie, he heard him, immediately. But then he opens the door wide, right? And what's out there?
Nothing
Nothing.
at first.
And in fact, the hallway is dark, which is bad. He's probably living in like a boarding house or something. People did that. And so imagine you have an apartment. And what does a hall look like normally when like if you were in an apartment building?
It's just a hallway with a bunch of doors.
Yeah, and it's just lit up. So even if you turn all the lights off in your apartment or in a hotel, same thing. The lights in the hallway are always on, right? They don't turn them off in the middle of the night. Everybody goes to
Yeah.
bed. No, they keep for safety more than anything else. They have cameras and everything else going, but they leave the lights on. And yet when he looks out, he opens his door to his room and it's just dark. Which that's usually a horror movie about to happen. You look outside and you're like, why are the lights all off out on the floor? And then there's a killer, and then it becomes a slasher movie. But he looks out and it's just dark, deep into that darkness peering. And he's literally he's like him trying to figure out what could possibly be out there, but there's no person. So, but he's wondering, he leaves it open for a while. It's kind of like those weird, creepy ghost videos, where somebody knocks on the front door and they go to open it and there's nobody out there. And you're like, why do you open the door? It's creepy, it's scary. And it's, of course, dark outside. But he says the silence was unbroken and stillness gave no token. So he hears nothing, sees nothing. And the only word there spoken was the whispered word Lenore. And he's the one who says it. This I whispered. And an echo murmured back the word Lenore. So he says it out in the hallway, Lenore. And it echoes back to him. And he's just like, okay, that's creepy. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping. Okay, so he shuts the door. And what happens? It's the whole Ghostbusters thing. Somebody raps again. And it's louder. And he goes, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. So he goes to the wind, to the window, and he thinks, okay, the window's just like banging against. Now we do have that does happen. You might have a tree branch or something, whacking against a window, and it might creep you out, and then you realize what it is, and you go, that's so silly. But he says, tis the wind and nothing more. And wind can be pretty vicious and it could rattle windows. So, that's
Oh yeah.
believable. We just had a hurricane, so we all know that. But open here I flung the shutter. Then, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Now, so at first he goes to the door and it's just dark, a dark hallway. He whispers Lenore, echoes back to him, and he shuts the door. Then the tapping starts again, but it was at the window. Now, how many of you, I say how many of you, you're only one of you. So, you're the only one who can answer, Jordan. But there are several times that I thought something was in one side of the house and it was in the other side of the house. And so I end up, sometimes somebody's knocking at my garage door and I open up the front door and I'm like, where is everybody? But all I heard was a door being knocked on. So that's exactly what he did. But he opens the window, and as soon as he does, in steps a raven. Now, ravens are, they're kind of like blackbirds, but they're bigger. And they often, most ravens have black beaks and black legs. So they're like all black. They're quite beautiful birds, actually. But ravens they can have, especially in folklore, they can have a bunch of different significant elements to them. And I can't remember what a group of, let me just a second. I know I have it somewhere.
Is it a group of raven that's called a murder?
I think so. I'm looking it up to make sure I don't steer y'all wrong. No, because it's a murder of crows. That's what it is.
Oh
I
yeah.
knew that was wrong when but it's an unkindness.
Oh,
Yes. So it's and it's the truth is ravens are often just like crows, connected to death, connected to deceit, treachery. They often have very negative connotations, at least in folklore, which Poe would have been very well versed in. And this reader, actually, this person, the persona in here, he actually says, remember, he was reading folklore. So he would be well versed in all of that. But here comes this raven, and he doesn't fly in, he steps in. First, he has a flirt and a flutter, but then he steps onto the sill and then walks in. And he doesn't like nod at him, he doesn't really like acknowledge him, but with a mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door. So up above the door that he just opened, and then whispered Lenore into, he perches on top of that. Up above that is a shelf with the bust of Pallas. And Pallas is a reference or an allusion. I'll put that in there. Allusion to Pallas Athena.
yeah.
And she's the goddess of wisdom in Greek mythology. And so there's just a bust of Pallas. That just means that it's like the shoulders, neck, and head of Athena. And there's just a little, a white marble sculpture or something like that up above the door, and he perches on top of her head or on her shoulder, one or the other. But he steps in to the window and then flies up and lands on the bust of Pallas. Now, because he does this is where we get to some significance. Why is it Athena? Well, if she's the goddess of wisdom, then this is suggesting that if anything, the raven is bringing in or aligned to reason. So he's going to come in and bring some sense of rational thought to what's going on. Now, before he comes, though, what's going on with this man?
He's
Remember,
mourning the loss of Lenore.
yes, he's sorrowing and he's trying to distract himself from it, but he's pining over this woman that he's lost, who's died. And even when he gets to the door, he's like, Lenore, saying her name, and yet he's kind of wallowing. He's just wallowing. That's what he's doing. Well, here comes this bird, and to bring reason to this man. Okay, that's at least what is suggested. We'll see if that happens, but that's what's suggested. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. In other words, it looked so stern that it actually made the man smile. And he says to this raven, he's talking to the bird, essentially, he said, even calls him ghastly and grim, which is really sad. Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven. Tell me what your lordly name is. So what is, and when night's Plutonian, and even, okay, night is of course aligned with that darkness and the mystery and stuff like that. But then we have Plutonian, and this is not a Pluto, the planet. This is
No.
Pluto, the Roman god, who is the equivalent of Hades, the god
Yeah.
of the underworld. So he's just making more references, which at that time, anybody who read a lot would have read a lot of Greek and, myth and stuff. So they would have gotten these allusions anyway. So he's just saying, okay, so what did they call you back in Hades, in other words? And the raven says, nevermore. So, and it's like, okay, and we'll probably think, that's your name? Really? So he even says, much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse. Because, okay, first of all, he was kind of making fun. What's your name back in Hades? But he didn't expect the bird to answer. And then the bird did. And he's like, whoa, But then he says, wait a second, his answer doesn't mean anything though. Why would a bird be called nevermore? That's just stupid. And then he even says, he goes, of course, none of this makes any sense because no living human being was never blessed with seeing a bird above his chamber door like this. On the bust of Pallas or whatever, that was named Nevermore. Like this has never happened before. So that's, we're in a very weird world where weird things are going on. And the fact that the bird can talk is just one more weird thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Second. Okay, so if that makes sense, and we know that this is weird, and it is, I've never had a bird come in and start talking to me, it's just never, no. And it certainly wasn't a raven, but I've never had a bird do that anyway. So he's already kind of blown away by the fact that the bird talked, but then he says, wait a second. The fact that he's called Nevermore is weird. The fact that he flew in is weird. All of this is weird. But the raven, of course, the raven's just sitting there while he's thinking all these weird, this is all weird, and kind of freaking out a bit. The raven's still just sitting there, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. So at this point, what the guy's going to try to figure out is, why is the raven saying this word? And that's going to be the quest for the rest of the poem. He's going to try to figure out, what is it that the raven, okay, it doesn't make sense that that's his name. That just, nobody would be named Nevermore. That just doesn't make sense, especially not a bird. But he says, well, it doesn't matter what his name is, because other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. And the bird said, nevermore. And so then we have to wonder, okay, so he's never leaving, or he'll never leave the man, like he'll stay with him. What does that even mean? And it's a mystery to the man in the poem. He doesn't know. But he just assumes, like he's lost Lenore and like he's all alone now, the bird's going to abandon him too. So now, of course, the bird says, no, I'm not going to. Because he says, oh, he'll just leave me, and just as everything else is left, including hope. So he's despairing. And then the bird says, no. Well, he says, nevermore. I can't put other words in there, because he only says one word. And so, startled at the stillness broken, so he's saying all this aloud, and the fact that the bird says again, nevermore. He says, doubtless what it utters is only stock and store caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore. So in other words, he learned this from this master, that he's somehow lost, like the guy died. He fell upon, some unmerciful disaster fell upon him. And so, and that's how he learned this word. That's why he keeps repeating it. It's the word he learned from his master. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling. So in other words, he's still like, he is distracting the guy from his sorrow. He's making him happier. And essentially he wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird and bust and door. And then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy. Essentially, he's saying, maybe, what could this bird be? And he starts thinking and imagining what reason the bird would have come, and why he would have visited him, and what it means, what it signifies, what that's foretelling for his future, blah, blah, blah. And especially, why does he say this word? So that's this. I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, so that he stops talking to him, to the bird. And the bird just stares at him with fiery eyes, which burned into my bosom's core. So the thing is like staring right through him, which is kind of disturbing. And with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining, which is his rhymes are just hilarious. But essentially, he's on the purple velvet seat, and he's kind of lounging around, and then it reminds him of who?
Lenore.
Yeah, she used to lay her head right here, and it's like, dang it. And here he was distracted for a bit, and now he's back to thinking of her. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer. That's just a perfume. Like it's like I don't know how to even. I mean, an unseen well, the censer could even be church with like incense. Swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor, and he says, "Wretch, God sent you, and He sent you with the angels." To give me respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. And so essentially he says, God sent this bird to help you forget Lenore and forget your sorrow for a bit. And the raven says, nevermore. I feel like every time he does this, I feel like saying, nope. Like in modern speak, what would this be? Nope, that's not why. And then he says, prophet. Now he calls him, instead of he's sent by God. Remember, this is what he said first. Nope, he's a thing of evil. And he says, whether tempter sent, and it's capitalized, so that means Satan or the devil, or whether
Yeah.
tempest tossed thee here ashore. So was it Satan that sent you, or were you just brought here by a storm? Essentially, you're haunting this, this home by a horror is haunted. So now you've come and you're making me unhappy. Tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Is there a beautiful future? Do I have any hope? Is there anything that's happy that's coming from, in my future? And he says, tell me. And the raven says, nope. There is not happiness coming. There is not balm in Gilead. And now he's really mad, and he calls him a thing of evil again, and repeats that same thing, if bird or devil. By that heaven that bends above us, now he's invoking God. By that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels. So will I ever be able to hold Lenore again? And the raven says, nope, nevermore. And the persona is furious. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend. And he gets up. Get thee back into the tempest, and the nights go back to hell. Go back to Hades. Leave no black plume as a token of thy soul hath spoken. So don't leave me feathers, so that I think that you were real. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Get out. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. In other words, you stabbed me. So get out. And the raven says, no, nevermore. And so what's the end? Well, the raven's still up there, sitting on the pallid bus of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And so, where's the man now? My soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. He's in the depths of despair. So no matter what reason or who sent him, or, essentially what the persona gets out of him is no hope. Like, don't go to the front door and open it and expect Lenore to be standing there. She's gone. Is she ever coming back? No, she's not. And she's going to be dead, and you're never going to get her back, and you're never going to get over this. And it's an absolute, it's like one of the first it's funny because whenever we do poetry slams, we always have some young men who show up, and they're all wearing black, and they write poems about death. And I always joke about it just because it's so common. But in a way, they're all following Poe. What did Poe write about? All these sad poems about death. And I could see him, I could totally imagine him wearing all black, in the modern era, and just being the dark, oh, here comes Poe again. And he comes in and he starts talking about this horrible poem about death. And everybody's like, well, that's depressing. And yet that's just, he's all caught up in that. And so, is it easy to do that? Yeah. Do people write poems that are really dark like this? Yeah, actually. In fact, that's one of a very typical theme in poems is contemplating the death or loss of someone, or contemplating one's own death. In fact, we're going to see that even in sonnets. When we get to Keats, he's going to talk about it. Mainly because his mom died, then his brother died, and then he died at a very young age. But this idea of never being able to rise above one's grief is really sad. I mean, that level of despair, even at the end, the last image we have is his soul kind of filtered into the shadow of the raven on the floor. And it'll never rise out of that shadow. That's terrible.
Yeah.
But, honestly, there are times in my life I have felt like this, or I thought I'm never going to recover from the sadness that I'm feeling now. Grief is a really rough thing. And the loss of someone that means a lot to us is so hard. People who haven't lost anyone they're really close to don't understand it. And even if they have, if it's been 20 years since it happened, it's amazing how callous people can be for people who are grieving. Telling them to I wish they'd just get over it and blah, blah, blah. Why do they keep whining about, so they lost their husband, who cares, and stuff. And it's really callous. And yet, how one grieves and how one gets out of it, those are as different stories as you can come up with. Each person, and each loss, it takes different steps to make it outside of grief. And right now, this persona is just caught in it. And I don't know, at least from the end of the poem, it gives no hope that he ever will come out of it, which is sad. Well, let me see if I can get to. Do you have any other questions about this one, or?
Um, I noticed that part of the way through the poem, the word hope was capitalized. And I
Mm-hmm.
was just wondering why did you think that was?
Well,
Is it to reference Lenore?
well, it could be, but it's more likely. You notice what is like seraphim is capitalized. That's an angel,
Yeah.
a type of angel.
Yeah.
Let's see, where are the other ones? And then you talked about hope, but you
Yeah.
also talk about like there's disaster, it's capitalized. And then he has hopes again, but I'm going backwards, but
So
all,
it's like giving emphasis.
well, the even Raven is these are all indications of deity, of deific connection, of mystical
Oh.
connection, good or bad. So even Pallas, that's her name, yes, but she's also a goddess. So she is of the immortals. The raven is of the immortals. He came, as far as this guy says, he came from Night's Plutonian shore. He came from Hades. And even the word night is like, that personified the deity night and the deity, Hades and all that stuff. Same with when we get to, I mean, if he'd had like hope is really it's deified in God, and then despair is the opposite. Despair is the absence of God. It's the lack of hope, or the loss of all hope, and it's considered to be sinful in traditional religious texts. And so, when you despair, you've lost all hope. And that's actually leading you away from God. And so disaster is the same type of thing. It's linked to um, evil. And so I think that all of those capitalizing things, even the Raven himself, because that's not his name, is those are all indications that those things are either good or bad. They are deified. They're godlike, or they're connected to the spiritual realm. Even horror, that's the evil side. And then we have balm and Gilead, but that balm and Gilead is an actual biblical phrase. So, and that's usually the balm is what will, and even Aden is that off place. So, and that's that kind of otherworldly place where people can end up. And a lot of these are, some of these are folkloric, some of these are Greek mythology, some of these are Roman mythology. He kind of mixes them all up. And a lot of them are Christian, but he equates all of them to that whole system. And all of it is above, it's not moral, it's immortal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess it ties in because at the beginning, he said he was reading in the books.
Mm-hmm.
And it
And he
and
was,
it also helps to sort of make you think of how, he's missing Lenore, so it's like spiritual and
mm-hmm.
spooky and
And
all
he's
that.
trying to figure out too. I mean, it's actually not unlike some of the earliest epic poems that we have. Gilgamesh dealt with the fact that, and this was written in Sanskrit. It's the earliest epic we have, but he had to deal with the fact that he was, even though he was a hero, he was mortal, and eventually he would die. And the same thing with the humans that are in the Iliad and Odyssey. They might be really strong warriors, but they are still at the mercy of the gods, and they will eventually all die. And so, that having to face that death is real, and that you don't come back from it, that it's not, oh, my wife died, but then tomorrow she'll come back and be at the door. Nope, she's just gone. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's just reality. And that's where that, the whole idea of Athena, she's the realist who would say, well, dude, everybody dies. Just calm down and deal with it. Don't hope, stop hoping that Lenore is going to be at the door. Because that, first of all, that's really creepy. If she died and then she comes back, she's going to be creepy. And we don't need a zombie bride to come back or something, that's not good. It actually conjures all sorts of ideas. And there are so many folk tales about people who essentially wish for their person back, and the person's dead. And so they come back as a creepy creature. Even like Harry Potter dealt with the Deathly Hallows, that story has that same thing happen, where a man who lost his bride wishes her to have life again. And it's just not going to work. That's not supposed
Yeah.
to happen. And so that's, you can't wish for Lenore to come back. That's creepy, dude. You just despair as much as you need to, and then eventually you have to live on or whatever, or give up. At the end of this poem, though, it seems like he assumes at this point he will just give up. So he says his soul will never be lifted from the shadow. So, and he might be right. We just don't know. That's the end of the poem. So that's all we can do. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there, though. I'm not going to go on to another sonnet, to one of the sonnets, because I don't want to take us too long, and I certainly don't want to go over, since you're already being patient enough to come here all by yourself. I am going to send out an email, though, and see if I can get more people to come and show up to these things, because many different people gave me all these time slots, so they should be showing up. I had at least 11 people who said they could come at this time alone, let alone all the other times. So we'll see if I can get some more people to come. Okay.
It's like they just wandered off the face of the earth.
Yeah, it's like they just forgot they had a class. They're still turning in work. They're just not coming to these things. But
Huh.
I don't even know that they're viewing them, because I can't get a sense on YouTube that there are a lot of views. So we'll have to see. And I have 2 large classes, so there should be a lot of views, but we'll see. We will see. But thank you for coming. I'm not going to complain at you, because you actually came. So yay.
Aw,
I
thank you.
appreciate you.
I
And
do have a quick
go ahead.
question. Um, I have you know how I mentioned earlier I have a sort of a difficult time figuring out, where the stress is on
Hmm. Hmm.
things? What is a way do you think that I could work to improve my ability to determine that?
Okay, so probably the best thing to do is really work at like the sonnets that we just did. Look at
Uh-huh.
those first. And then I'm going to give you a couple of poems right here that you can do that are great practice. One is Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. And that's by Robert Frost. And honestly, there are many poems by Robert Frost that really lend themselves to this, that have a very distinct rhyme and rhythm, and it's pretty consistent. But sonnets are probably the best ones just to practice on that kind of stuff. And I believe me, if I have you scan something or I have you tell me what are these lines, they're probably going to be iambic pentameter because
Okay.
we're studying the sonnet form more than any other form, and it is really iambic is the most common meter for any English poems. That is by far the most common metrical unit used in English, mainly because we talk a lot like that. So the
Thank
cadences
you
of
so
English
much.
fit it. Yeah, if there's, but Stopping by Woods, and there's one other one by him. Oh, the Road Not Taken.
Oh yeah.
That's another good one. And those are fun poems. I think I have both of them in here. I don't know that I have them in all the readings, but they're good ones to practice with. And honestly, the more you practice with it, the easier it gets, but you're always going to find variances. And that's probably the hard thing for a lot of people is they want it all to be super consistent. And poets just don't do that. Most of them don't anyway. So,
I think it's just difficult for me, in the sense that, if you gave me a word to say, okay, well, where's the stress on this word? That's actually a little difficult for me for some reason.
no, I understand. It's really one thing you can do if you have like a several syllable word though,
Hmm.
look it up in a dictionary and it will give you where it'll have an accent, like a little slash mark above the stressed syllable. And almost
Thank you.
always that will match the stress pattern of the poem. We have a couple of exceptions. I know that there's a song Walk Like an Egyptian by the
Oh
Bangles,
yeah.
and it's totally the wrong. They use that word Egyptian, and it's an Egyptian, and it's always sounded weird to me because they totally use the wrong. It should be Egyptian, and the emphasis should be on the middle syllable. But that's normal. That happens all the time. But most of those multi-syllable words are going to be used correctly with a poet who's doing this kind of rhythmic scheme. So I would always start with the multi-syllable words and look them up in the dictionary until you get more attuned to that, to hearing it. And you'll go, oh yeah, of course it is. But honestly, if you pronounce it wrong, when I said Egyptian, that sounds weird.
So with that, when you say it that way, is the stress on the shun part?
Yeah, well, it's Egyptian. And so the first and third syllables are in the actual, I mean, it goes with the pattern of rhythms in the song, but it's because of the word they use, they have to stress the wrong syllables. And so they stress the first and third when really in the actual when you read the word, it's the middle syllable. Like nevermore is nevermore. And so it's stressed, unstressed, stressed. Nevermore. You would never say nevermore. That doesn't make any sense. Nevermore. It sounds like a different word.
Yeah.
And so the more you can emphasize, like tempest, you can tell tempest as opposed to tempest. I sorry, I'm just laughing. Like token versus token. We just don't say that.
So it's almost like when the stress part of the word has just a little bit more oomph behind it,
Yeah.
so to speak.
So it's like loneliness. We know lone is the big one, and it often is extended in English. So it takes a little longer to say that syllable than the other ones. I mean, Lee almost disappears. Loneliness. So it's just like bum, bum, bum.
So
Almost
you
like
would,
the,
yeah,
the,
because
go ahead.
you wouldn't say loneliness or
No,
something.
loneliness.
It's a
Loneliness.
little weird.
That sounds weird. It sounds like the loneliness of the woods. It doesn't make any sense. Like it's, I don't know. But you could say loneliness. And that's just saying that both this and this are stressed. Loneliness. Loneliness, unbroken. So it's stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. Loneliness, unbroken. And the cadence is normal for us. We are used to. That's probably another reason it's hard is because we're used to iambic. We talk mostly in iambic pentameter. Well, not pentameter, but iambic rhythms. And so it doesn't. It's like when you talk to people who have your same accent, you don't notice the accent, but when you talk to someone with a different accent, then you notice it. It's that kind of thing. We don't notice
Yeah,
the cadences because we're used to them. They're just normal, if that makes sense.
yeah. Thank you so much. I'll definitely look those over.
Okay, and just let me know if you come up with something, or even if you write on it, like you print it off and then you put the little marks, feel free to share it with me and say, is this right? And I'll give you feedback.
Oh, thank you so
No
much.
problem. Have a good evening. I will see
You
you
too.
later. Enjoy your reading and
Oh, and I
talk to you
wanted to
soon.
ask,
Hmm?
so are we not having any meetings next week?
We can't. I'm going to go